It was late November when I decided to venture into the Alaskan wilderness. I had always felt a pull toward the peace and beauty of the snow-covered landscape. This time, I planned to spend a week by myself in a secluded cabin far from any signs of civilization. The thought of being alone in the vast, frozen wilderness thrilled me. I set out early that morning, my backpack loaded with supplies. The air was crisp, and my breath formed mist in the chilly air. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my way through the trees. The cabin was about a day's hike from the nearest town, and I had carefully planned my route. As the day wore on, the sky darkened, and the temperature dropped. The forest was strangely quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of branches. I finally arrived at the cabin just as the sun began to set. It was a small wooden building, mostly covered in snow. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was cold and dark, so I quickly lit a fire in the small stove and unpacked my things. The flickering firelight cast shadows on the walls, and the warmth began to spread through the room. I felt a sense of calm as I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood. That night, I slept soundly, the silence of the wilderness surrounding me like a blanket. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area around the cabin. I put on my heavy coat and gloves and stepped outside. The view was stunning. The snow-covered trees glittered in the sunlight, and the air was so clear it felt like I could see for miles. I spent the day wandering through the woods, enjoying the solitude and beauty of it all. As the sun began to set, I headed back to the cabin. While walking, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed different, almost as if it were watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued on my way. When I reached the cabin, I felt a sense of relief and quickly went inside, lighting the fire. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence felt heavier, and I found myself straining to hear anything. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to move, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I told myself it was all in my head and tried to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. I decided to stay near the cabin and spent the day chopping wood and gathering supplies. As the day went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When night fell, the feeling of dread intensified. I sat by the fire trying to read, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin and gust of wind made me jump. I felt like someone was watching me, but when I looked, there was no one there. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would ease my fear. As I lay in bed, I heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper. I strained to listen, but it quickly faded. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to drift off. In the middle of the night, I was startled awake by a strange sound, low, rhythmic thumping coming from outside. Frozen with fear, I lay in bed, listening. The sound grew louder and closer, and my heart began to race. I slowly got out of bed and made my way to the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked out into the moonlight. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a tall, thin figure, staring directly at me. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but it was gone. I stood there, trembling, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin. I packed up my things and set off early. As I walked through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I hurried, my heart racing, until I finally reached the town. I felt a wave of relief as I saw the lights of the houses. I knew I was safe. I never went back to that cabin. The experience left me with a deep sense of fear. What was once a beautiful, peaceful wilderness now felt like a place of danger and dread. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, far from the noise and rush of everyday life, was comforting. I packed my SUV with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a couple of bottles of wine. As I drove deeper into the forest, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The trees were tall and thick, and the air was fresh and crisp. I found the perfect spot near a small clearing with a view of the starry sky. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. As the sun began to set, I lit a small fire and opened a bottle of wine. The crackling fire and the soft rustling of the leaves were the only sounds. I felt completely at ease. I sipped my wine and watched the stars appear one by one. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright. It was a perfect night. I must have fallen asleep under the stars, because I woke up suddenly. It was still dark, but something had changed. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air felt colder. Then I heard it, a distant chanting. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder and more distinct. My heart started to race. I sat up and listened carefully. The chanting seemed to be coming from deep in the forest, far away but getting closer. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. But the chanting continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It sounded eerie, like some kind of ritual. I quickly crawled into my tent and grabbed my knife, keeping it close. Lying down with my heart pounding, I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that no one could find me out here. But the chanting wouldn't stop, and I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal again. I felt silly for being so scared the night before. I packed up my things and decided to have breakfast. As I was getting ready to leave, I heard a soft knock on my SUV. My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing by the driver's side door. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, their face hidden in the shadow of a hood. Fear surged through me, and I screamed. The figure didn't move at first, then suddenly turned and ran into the forest. My scream echoed through the trees, and the forest fell silent again. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. Who was that? How had they found me? Why were they here? I quickly packed up the rest of my gear and got into the SUV. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I drove for a while, trying to put as much distance between me and that figure as possible. Hours later, I found a new spot to set up camp. It was far from where I had seen the figure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I didn't light a fire, didn't drink any wine. I sat in my tent, clutching my knife and listening to every sound. The forest was alive with noises: rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant animal calls. Every sound made me jump. I barely slept, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over. Who was that person? How had they gotten so close without me noticing? What was that chanting? The next morning, I decided to leave the forest. The peace and solitude I had sought were gone, replaced by a constant sense of fear. As I packed up my tent for the last time, I noticed something on the ground near my campfire. Footprints. They were large and deep, leading from the forest to where I had been sleeping. My heart raced as I realized the figure had been closer than I thought. I drove back to civilization, my mind swirling with questions and fear. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I wouldn't be returning to that forest anytime soon. The memory of the chanting, the lurking figure, and the footprints would haunt me for a long time. The wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of mystery and fear. Living in the remote mountains of Alaska is both awe-inspiring and unnerving in the summer. The endless daylight and vast skies make you feel fully alive, but the long winters bring a chilling silence and darkness that can feel overwhelming. It is during these dark months that I feel the most isolated. The snow-covered forests and tundra seem to stretch on forever, blanketing everything in stillness, broken only by the sound of my boots crunching through the snow or the creaking of ice beneath my feet. Sometimes, the quiet feels almost suffocating, pressing in on me like a physical force, making my heart race and my breath come quicker. It's not the danger from animals like bears, wolves, or even the occasional moose that scares me. It's the eerie emptiness. I live in a small cabin, miles away from the nearest town. It's a modest place, just enough to keep me warm and fed through the bitter winter months. One evening, the silence around me felt different, heavier, more oppressive. I sat by the fire trying to read, but couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something watching me. But there was nothing, just darkness. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. But as I lay under layers of blankets, the unsettling feeling of being watched refused to leave me. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks due to the isolation, but the sensation persisted. The following morning, I found unusual tracks in the snow around my cabin. They weren't from any animal I recognized, large, almost human, but with an odd, uneven gait. The tracks circled the cabin and came close to the windows before vanishing into the woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or trapper passing through. But something about the tracks didn't sit right with me. They were too strange, and no one would be out in these conditions without letting their presence be known. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my chores, but always found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. The silence of the forest seemed heavier, the emptiness more stifling. One evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to follow the tracks. I bundled up, grabbed my rifle, and set out. The tracks were faint now, covered by a light layer of snow, but still visible. They led me deeper into the woods, far from the safety of my cabin. The silence around me grew even more intense, the sound of my heartbeat and breath louder than anything else. I tried to stay calm, but a gnawing fear crept into my thoughts. What if I got lost? What if I didn't make it back before dark? The tracks led me to a small clearing where they abruptly stopped. There was no sign of what had made them, no trace of where they had gone. It was as if they had disappeared. I stood there, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, feeling more alone than ever. As I turned to head back, I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. Tall and thin, with long, bony limbs, it had dark, hollow eyes and a twisted, toothless grin. It was staring directly at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, it just watched. Slowly, I raised my rifle, hands trembling. But before I could aim, the figure melted back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I ran back to the cabin, not caring about the noise I made or the tracks I left behind. The silence no longer felt empty. It was filled with the echo of my fear. I bolted the door and sat by the fire, clutching my rifle, waiting for the morning. The next day, the tracks were gone, covered by a fresh layer of snow. The figure never appeared again, but the fear remained. The quiet of the Alaskan winter, once my companion, had become a constant reminder of how vulnerable I truly was. The emptiness that once offered comfort now haunted me, making me question my own sanity. Before we continue to the next story, If this is your first time here, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for more chilling stories. We appreciate your support. Share these stories with your friends and family. A few years ago, I decided to go camping with about 10 friends at a hot spring in the eastern part of Oregon on Friday the 13th, which also happened to coincide with a full moon. The drive took just over an hour, and since I had work the next day, I decided not to drink too much so I wouldn't be hungover in the morning. We arrived, set up camp in a nice spot far from the other campers, and cracked open a few beers. After that, we took a dip in the nearby hot springs, and when the sun went down, we went for a walk to enjoy the mountains lit up by the full moon and stars. It was really dark at this point, and some people decided to head back to camp, leaving only a few of us for the night walk. Now, just a side note, the three of us who went had been microdosing mushrooms most of the night, so things were a little trippy, but I didn't like to get too out of it or lose track of my surroundings. It was just the four of us. Myself, two friends, and one of my friend's dogs. Walking uphill for about 10 minutes with our flashlights lighting the path ahead of us when we suddenly turned right onto a trail. We hadn't even made it 3 minutes when we heard some loud rustling nearby. We stopped, and my friend in the front started scanning the area with his flashlight. If you've ever seen a big cat's eyes glowing in the dark, you know how chilling it can be, especially when the cat is bigger than you. That's when we saw it. Right in front of us, just a few yards away, a massive mountain lion. Instinct kicked in and we all slowly backed away. The dog, however, had its own instincts and ran off to the side into the woods. But the mountain lion didn't follow. Instead, it just kept its glowing eyes fixed on us. We continued backing up until we couldn't anymore, and that's when we saw the dog right next to us again. Then we heard something running up behind us. We shined the flashlight, and to our horror, we saw another mountain lion. This one seemed smaller, probably the first one's cub. There was a campsite just beyond a fence, and with no choice, we turned around and jumped it. We got the dog over first, then followed, tearing up our clothes in the process. One of my friends even cut his leg pretty badly. Now we were in someone else's campsite on Friday the 13th under a full moon, tripping on mushrooms, and totally lost. We had no idea where the other campers were, but we didn't care. We got into their unlocked car and honked the horn for a minute to try and scare off the mountain lions. We made sure to yell, letting anyone nearby know we weren't thieves, but that there were big cats close by. We finally stopped honking after a few minutes and left, weirded out that no one came to check on their campsite. My friend swore she heard someone screaming, but her boyfriend insisted we needed to leave. Part of me believed her, even though I didn't hear anything, but I was just ready to get away. We finally found the exit to their campsite, and on the way back to ours, I said a quick prayer, though I'm not religious. We got back to camp, but every rustling sound around me made me feel like we were being stalked by the mountain lions. I had a full-blown panic attack in the car for about an hour, feeling tense all over because of the sunroof being cracked. Everyone else was enjoying themselves around the campfire, even the other two who had gone through the same thing. The next morning, I woke up hungover, didn't show up to my job, and got fired when I returned to town. It sucked, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be alive. I work with a volunteer search and rescue team, and every year we have a late summer retreat filled with team building exercises. One of the key activities is night training, where we practice our search and rescue skills in the dark. My role is SNRK 9 handler, which is why I joined in the first place. I've always loved animals, but didn't have the grades to be a vet. So being a dog handler allowed me to combine my passion for working with animals and doing something meaningful with my time. Playing with dogs is a loose way to describe it, but you get the idea. During one of our night exercises, my dog, trained to find human remains, alerted us to a scent. I was partnered with a senior team member at the time, and when I looked to her for advice, she simply said, "Let's follow it." Now, you might be wondering why I wasn't panicking when my dog picked up the scent of human remains. The reason is simple. Even the best trained cadaver dogs sometimes make mistakes, and in an area like Washington, with the heavy rain we get, damp scents can confuse them. So, when my dog started alerting, our protocol was to follow it and see what happened. Worst case, we find human remains. Best case, it's a false alarm. We decided to split up temporarily. My partner stayed on the trail while my dog and I followed the scent, figuring it would just be a short diversion. But as minutes passed, it turned into about 10 minutes of walking through the dark woods. Eventually, my dog led me down a steep slope, and I lost my footing, falling badly. My chest burned, likely from 2 broken ribs, and I felt blood trickling down where I hit my head on a rock. I hit the emergency alert button on my GPS, which would notify base camp that I needed help. Then, I started calling for my dog, since I'd lost the leash during my fall. I wasn't sure if he ran off scared or was just following the scent, thinking I was still behind him. I was in pain, confused, and since I dropped my flashlight, I couldn't see anything. I lay there, calling out for Brody, hoping someone from base camp was on their way. I'm not sure how long I waited, but when I heard footsteps approaching, a wave of relief washed over me. I called out, thinking it was one of my fellow volunteers, but when the voice replied, I knew right away it wasn't someone from our team. It was a man's voice, and instead of helping me, he began talking about the dry creek bed I was in. He said that it was a dangerous place, one where people fell every year, and at least one person died from the flash floods during the rainy season. I went from asking for help to begging for it, but he just ignored me and kept going on about how dangerous the area was, as if he was giving a lecture. Sent a chill down my spine. I got angry and yelled at him, but his response was cold. "You're not in a position to talk to me like that." At that point, I started screaming for help, over and over, even though the pain in my chest made every shout worse. Then I heard Brody. He was calling for me with his usual vocal sounds, and as soon as he did, the stranger stopped talking. I could hear the man's footsteps quickly retreating, and I kept calling for help. A minute or two later, more footsteps came, and this time it was a group of people with flashlights. When they found me, I immediately told them about the man who had been talking to me. His words had been unsettling, almost like threats disguised as warnings. Creeped me out. One of my rescuers asked if I had been pushed, worried that the stranger might have caused my fall, but I reassured them that I slipped on my own. The man didn't push me, but he had been there watching. My 2 teammates stayed with me until the medic arrived with an ATV and a backboard, and I was slowly taken back to base camp. After a quick check, we headed to a remote clinic where they confirmed I had broken ribs. Once I was stable and given some pain medication, I was finally able to tell everyone about the strange man and his eerie warnings. A week later, after I returned home and was discharged from the hospital, I received a call from the same senior team member I'd been with before the fall. She asked how I was recovering and mentioned that the team leaders had discussed moving next year's retreat to a different location. Some other team members had reported seeing someone wandering the woods in the dark who didn't belong, and after talking about it, the leaders decided they wouldn't risk another encounter with that strange figure. Safety was the priority, and they didn't want to take any chances. My name is Alex, and I'm a longtime fan from Sydney, Australia. The story I'm about to share involves you and your YouTube channel in a bit of an unexpected way. I met my girlfriend in June of 2020, and it was her who first introduced me to your videos. At first, I thought it was a bit strange that scary stories helped her fall asleep, but after a while, I started to get why she liked them. We'd often play a video while doing the dishes after dinner, and it became a little routine for us. Then, one evening in early March the following year, we were listening to some camping stories of yours when my girlfriend suggested we visit the spot in Blackwood Valley. It's about a 4-hour drive out of Sydney and a well-known spot for hikers and campers. I know it sounds a bit odd to listen to a bunch of scary camping stories and then think, that sounds fun, let's go. But we were pretty confident that we wouldn't be in any danger. Rural crime is rare around there, so we weren't worried, at least not at first. But what happened next made the whole situation pretty ironic. We made our way to Blackwood Valley, and I remember it clearly, March 22nd, 2021. We had bought camping gear online and were looking for a good spot to set up our tents when we came across a couple of other campers. They were standing just off the trail, and not far from them was a burnt-out utility vehicle with what looked like a charred tent nearby. There was a man and a woman there, both looking to be in their 20s. The man was pacing and holding a phone to his ear, looking pretty distressed. I thought they must have accidentally set their tent or car on fire somehow, but figuring out exactly what had happened wasn't our first priority. We just wanted to make sure they were okay. As we walked up the trail, the man thanked the person on the phone and hung up, just as we were getting closer. He told us it wasn't their campsite, they had just found it, and he'd called the authorities because it was obviously recent. You could smell the burnt debris from the trail, so we knew he was right. He also mentioned that there was some fresh food nearby, which made him think it wasn't just some kids causing trouble. He had actually been talking to the police when we arrived. After wishing the couple good luck, we continued on our way. It all seemed harmless, and we didn't think anything sinister was happening. It looked like there had been an accident, and someone might have been hurt, but there were no signs of a struggle, no blood or anything like that. Later, back home, my girlfriend sent me a link to a local news story. The burnt vehicle and tent we had seen belonged to an elderly couple who had been camping in the area. They had gone missing, and there was a public appeal for information. Naturally, we got in touch to offer any help we could. But to be honest, we didn't think we had much to contribute. We had been in the valley for 2 nights, and aside from the encounter with the other couple and the burnt campsite, we hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. For a while, we even began to wonder if the couple we met had something to do with it. After all, they had just arrived, asked if they needed help, and then left so quickly. The man had said he'd been on the phone with emergency services, but we had no way of confirming that. When we told the police about the couple, they mentioned they'd already spoken with them, but they didn't give us any further details or let us know when the call had been made. We were just being paranoid. Turns out the couple we met had nothing to do with the case. About 1.5 years later, the bodies of the missing couple were found. It was sad, but I can't say it was a complete shock to me or my girlfriend. It seemed clear that they had been victims of some kind of accidental fire, which probably left them injured or worse. They had likely gotten lost, hurt, or even worse, and sadly, nature had claimed their lives. I remember my girlfriend saying that if they'd been in the tent while it burned, they could have inhaled toxic smoke or even been severely burned, and those injuries could have led to infection. It was just a tragic way to go, and our hearts went out to their family and friends. But then the story took an even darker turn. It came to light that the elderly couple hadn't died in an accident at all. They had been murdered. Their tent and vehicle had been set on fire to cover up any evidence. To think we had been at the scene completely unaware was chilling. From what we later read online, the murder had occurred less than 24 hours before we arrived. If we had come a day earlier, we might have seen the killer hanging around or even crossed paths with them. It made us wonder how different things could have been if we had arrived sooner or if the trail had been busier. Still, we felt horrible for their loved ones, but at the same time, we couldn't help but wonder about the details. Call it morbid curiosity, but we were desperate to know what had happened. We spent 2 nights in that valley after the murders. Was there any danger for us? Was someone hunting people at random? Or was it a personal crime? Turned out it wasn't either. It wasn't some psycho serial killer roaming the valley. The killer and the victims had never met before. The whole thing had started because of an argument over a drone. It's in the courts now, or at least it was when I decided to write this up and send it to you. I'd suggest you look it up, but it's as confusing as it is tragic. The killer's defense team claimed that the elderly couple had pointed a gun at him, and he somehow managed to overpower them, kill them both, and then burn everything, evidence and their bodies. The defense even had him claiming he was sorry for what he had done, vomiting from the smell and trying to make himself seem like a victim. It's disgusting. Anyway, good luck with your channel, and I wish you all the best. I'm not sure when the guy will be sentenced, but I hope it's for a long time. It's horrifying to think that someone would kill over a drone. In 2011, I decided to organize a camping trip for myself and some friends. All spring long, they were excited about the idea of us camping together. Just a bunch of guys, no phones, just living in the moment. But as the date drew closer, one by one, each of the 4 guys dropped out, giving me different reasons for why they couldn't make it. It was really disappointing. I had been looking forward to an exciting adventure, and I had already spent quite a bit of money on all the gear and clothing I thought I needed. I was kind of crushed that the trip was about to be called off, but then I thought, why not go alone? We had planned for mid-July, the best time for camping in the Northeast, and I knew I could either stick to the date or wait a whole year for another chance. So, I packed my gear, and on the day we were supposed to leave, I set out solo for a few days in Acadia National Park. The 3 days I spent there ended up being incredible. I honestly thought I might regret going alone or get bored out of my mind, but I couldn't have been more wrong. From setting up camp to gathering firewood, setting up bear alarms, and getting the fire started, I was busy the whole time. I barely had a minute to myself until sundown. When it finally got dark, I was too on edge to relax. Being alone in the woods at night is creepy, and since it was my first time camping in a decade, it took some getting used to. But eventually, I got used to the nighttime sounds, and after a while, replaying scenes from the Blair Witch Project in my head lost its effect. By the second and third nights, things felt much easier, and I was able to get some decent sleep. On the third night, though, I woke up feeling extremely uncomfortable. There's no easy way to put it, so I'll just be blunt. I hadn't been able to go to the bathroom for 3 days. Every time I thought about it, I imagined a snake slithering up to me or a spider biting me. There are no venomous snakes in Maine, but they'll still bite if they're in the mood. The thought of squatting in the woods was seriously unappealing, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. I was constantly moving around during the day, which meant I was eating a lot, and the more I ate, the more I needed to go. So I grabbed my headlamp, set it to a dim blue light so it was harder to spot, and walked a little way into the woods with some wet wipes. I didn't walk far, but I didn't want to be too close to where I'd eat breakfast the next morning. After walking for a minute or two, I finally found a spot, leaned against a tree, and took care of business. I'll spare you the rest of the details, but everything went fine. I wiped up and started heading back to my camp. Just as I was about 80 feet away from camp, I saw a flashlight beam shining nearby. The sudden appearance of another person in the middle of the night set off alarm bells in my head. Sure, there were a few innocent reasons for someone to be out there, but there were plenty of unsettling ones too. Instead of just walking back to camp to see what the stranger wanted, I turned off my headlamp and ducked behind a tree to stay hidden. Some of you might be wondering why I chose the dim blue light, but it's because if someone's using a bright flashlight like the guy I saw, it's easy to get night blindness and they won't notice the faint blue light. I crouched behind the tree, watching as the flashlight beam moved around my camp. I couldn't see the person holding the flashlight clearly, but I could tell they were inspecting my camp, looking for something. A few moments later, a second flashlight appeared, and now there were 2 people moving around my campsite. They stopped for a minute and began talking to each other. I couldn't catch every word, but I clearly heard one of them say, "We'll just come back tomorrow." That line made my stomach drop. I mean, it's one thing if two guys just randomly came across my campsite, but for one of them to know I was there, that was terrifying. I had set up bear alarms, basically tripwires with noisemakers, and these guys had made it all the way to my camp without triggering any of them. The alarms weren't easy to spot, especially at night, but the fact that they got so close to my camp without any noise made me feel uneasy. I watched them for a little while longer. One of them said, "We'll come back tomorrow," and then both of them turned and walked away. I stayed where I was for about 10 to 15 minutes, debating what to do. I was certain that at least one of them had been watching me, and I was worried they'd come back the moment I returned to my camp. I wanted to just pack up and leave, but I knew that would make a lot of noise, and it'd be impossible to do that without turning on my headlamp. Plus, if they had night vision equipment, I'd be an easy target. I know it might sound like I was overthinking it, but in that moment, all I could do was sit in the darkness, barely breathing, letting my thoughts and fears consume me. Eventually, I saw the first light of dawn, and I felt safe enough to creep back to camp and start packing. I did it as quietly as possible. Instead of having breakfast like I'd planned, I decided to head back to my car. It took much longer than it normally would have because I avoided regular trails. On my way off the island, I stopped by the park's information center and asked if any of the rangers had been patrolling after dark. They hadn't. In fact, they didn't even know anything about the kind of campers who'd walk up on someone's camp at night. I was invited to file a report, but I wasn't exactly eager to come back to Acadia anytime soon. Patapsco State Park had always been one of my favorite spots. I grew up just outside of Baltimore in a town called Woodlawn, which some of you might recognize, though not for the best reasons. I went to Woodlawn High, the same school that Adnan Syed and Heyman Lee attended, the same one that became infamous through the Serial podcast. For those who might not know, Serial was one of the first major true crime podcasts and told the story of how Adnan was accused of murdering his girlfriend. Hey, this case cast a long shadow over Woodlawn, and the reputation of Baltimore had been on a decline since The Wire aired. During my last year of middle school, I loved both places and spent an embarrassing amount of time defending them in online gaming forums. But then came the day when I couldn't defend Baltimore or the larger county anymore, and it just so happened to be the day I vowed never to return to Patapsco State Park. In the summer of 2014, my girlfriend and I decided to visit, as Patapsco offers plenty of places to camp, each with its own table and fire ring. I'd spent nearly my entire life hiking and camping in the park, so it had become one of my favorite places. I knew it well, even the secluded, beautiful spot along the river and near the train tracks. It was a stretch of barely trodden trail, right by the river, and when no train passed by, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. I was excited to show it to my girlfriend, thinking if I found it beautiful, she'd love it too. We drove to Patapsco, found an empty campsite, and after setting up, we crossed the train tracks and started heading toward the river. We were about 10 to 15 minutes into the hike when my girlfriend, snapping pictures of the river, suddenly stopped and whispered, "Did you hear that?" We heard voices from across the water. The river wasn't wide, but with the summer foliage in full bloom, we couldn't see who was on the other side. Then, someone suddenly burst from the bushes and ran into the river. They looked terrified, and as they ran, they tripped on something and splashed into the water in what looked like a bad fall. I was about to jog up the bank to check if he was okay when, just as I moved, he stood up, turned around, and screamed, "No, please no!" The next thing we heard was the sound of 3 gunshots. Bang, 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 and he fell back into the water. It all happened in a flash. One moment we heard voices and saw the man fall, and the next he was dead. But I swear, before his body even hit the water, my girlfriend and I were already running. We didn't think twice when we heard the shots. It was a total switch in our minds. We went from being at ease to running for our lives. Sure, we weren't the ones being shot at, but if someone was willing to kill like that, I figured they wouldn't want witnesses. What really sticks with me is how I didn't run as fast as I could have. The whole time we were sprinting, I was trying to keep my body between her and the shooter, thinking that if anyone was going to be hit, it should be me, not her. I'm not saying that to sound brave, it was purely instinct. I remember the crawling sensation that came with it, slowing myself down when I wanted to take off. At the same time, I was hoping I wouldn't get shot, and if I did, that the bullet wouldn't go through me and hit her too. She was incredible, though. She ran like the wind and was as quiet as possible, not slowing down until we were safely back across the tracks. Without a doubt, those were the scariest few minutes of my life. If it had just been me or maybe a guy friend, it would have been terrifying. But with my girlfriend there, it made everything that much worse. There was this overwhelming instinct to protect her, but deep down, I knew I couldn't shield her from someone with a gun if they meant to hurt us. The best I could do was try to shield her, and I'm proud I did that, but it still made for a harrowing experience. We made it out safely and called the authorities as soon as we could, but I still don't know who the man was or if his killer was ever caught. I'd say that the most dangerous experience I've ever had happened during a solo camping trip in late June of 2012. For those of you who may not remember or haven't heard of it, the area in West Virginia where I was staying is known for these intense summer storms that occur every few years, which locals call dikas. I'm not great at explaining this sort of thing, so here's a definition from weather.gov. A dika is a long-lasting windstorm connected to rapidly moving bands of showers or thunderstorms. While a dika can cause damage similar to tornadoes, it's typically more focused in one direction, creating a narrow, straight path. If the wind includes gusts of at least 58 miles per hour, the event may be classified as a row. To put that in perspective, a mild hurricane has winds above 70 miles per hour, so you can think of the row as a smaller version of a hurricane. They can be dangerous, but most people just find them a bit of a nuisance. Now, imagine camping alone in the middle of West Virginia. When the sky starts to darken and you realize the wind is strong enough to uproot trees. That's when I really started to get scared. Thankfully, while I was looking for a safe place to camp that night, I found a small man-made shelter. It wasn't much, just a single concrete wall protecting me. But in the event of a nearby falling tree, it could be the difference between life and death. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't the only one who had the idea to seek shelter. About an hour before sundown, with the wind still howling through the trees, I heard the heavy sound of something running toward the shelter. I couldn't see it at first due to the wind and the shelter's positioning, but then, right before I could react, I saw it, a black bear. The storm had clearly scared it, which was very bad news for me. I immediately jumped to my feet, waving my arms and shouting, trying to make myself appear as big and intimidating as possible. But as you can imagine, that wasn't enough to scare the bear away. It saw me, jumped back in fright, and then continued running in the direction it was going. However, it soon circled around the other side of the shelter, coming back towards me. It wasn't leaving, it was just figuring out whether I was worth challenging. And with each loop, it got closer. After several more rounds, I could hear the sound of its claws tapping on the concrete just a few feet away. The bear was angry, confused, and getting closer. At that point, I backed away, trying to put more distance between us. But the more I moved, the more ground I gave up, until suddenly, the bear darted into the shelter and took a swipe at me before retreating again. I quickly grabbed my backpack to use as a makeshift shield for the next attack. The bag still had most of my gear in it, so it was heavy, and I planned on using it as a battering ram if the bear charged again. My heart raced as the bear circled once more. As it neared the shelter, it seemed to be gearing up to rush at me. But then, seeing me holding my pack, the bear seemed startled. The sight of my changed size and shape must have intimidated it, because it hesitated and eventually ran off. In the chaos, I debated my next move. Staying in the shelter seemed like a risk since the bear might come back, but being out in the woods without protection was just as dangerous. Trees could easily fall in the storm. If I moved, I risked the bear catching me. But if I stayed and kept using my backpack as a shield, I might survive another attack. It might have seemed crazy to some, but I was more worried about the trees falling than the bear. So, I decided to stay in the shelter and endure a sleepless, terrifying night, hoping the storm would pass and the bear wouldn't return. Living in the remote mountains of Alaska is both awe-inspiring and unnerving in the summer. The endless daylight and vast skies make you feel fully alive, but the long winters bring a chilling silence and darkness that can feel overwhelming. It is during these dark months that I feel the most isolated. The snow-covered forests and tundra seem to stretch on forever, blanketing everything in stillness, broken only by the sound of my boots crunching through the snow or the creaking of ice beneath my feet. Sometimes, the quiet feels almost suffocating, pressing in on me like a physical force, making my heart race and my breath come quicker. It's not the danger from animals like bears, wolves, or even the occasional moose that scares me. It's the eerie emptiness. I live in a small cabin, miles away from the nearest town. It's a modest place, just enough to keep me warm and fed through the bitter winter months. One evening, the silence around me felt different, heavier, more oppressive. I sat by the fire trying to read, but couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something watching me. But there was nothing, just darkness. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. But as I lay under layers of blankets, the unsettling feeling of being watched refused to leave me. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks due to the isolation, but the sensation persisted. The following morning, I found unusual tracks in the snow around my cabin. They weren't from any animal I recognized, large, almost human, but with an odd, uneven gait. The tracks circled the cabin and came close to the windows before vanishing into the woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or trapper passing through. But something about the tracks didn't sit right with me. They were too strange, and no one would be out in these conditions without letting their presence be known. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my chores, but always found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. The silence of the forest seemed heavier, the emptiness more stifling. One evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to follow the tracks. I bundled up, grabbed my rifle, and set out. The tracks were faint now, covered by a light layer of snow, but still visible. They led me deeper into the woods, far from the safety of my cabin. The silence around me grew even more intense, the sound of my heartbeat and breath louder than anything else. I tried to stay calm, but a gnawing fear crept into my thoughts. What if I got lost? What if I didn't make it back before dark? The tracks led me to a small clearing where they abruptly stopped. There was no sign of what had made them, no trace of where they had gone. It was as if they had disappeared. I stood there, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, feeling more alone than ever. As I turned to head back, I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. Tall and thin, with long, bony limbs, it had dark, hollow eyes and a twisted, toothless grin. It was staring directly at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just watched. Slowly, I raised my rifle, hands trembling. But before I could aim, the figure melted back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I ran back to the cabin, not caring about the noise I made or the tracks I left behind. The silence no longer felt empty. It was filled with the echo of my fear. I bolted the door and sat by the fire, clutching my rifle, waiting for the morning. The next day, the tracks were gone, covered by a fresh layer of snow. The figure never appeared again, but the fear remained. The quiet of the Alaskan winter, once my companion, had become a constant reminder of how vulnerable I truly was. The emptiness that once offered comfort now haunted me, making me question my own sanity. Before we continue to the next story, if this is your first time here, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for more chilling stories. We appreciate your support. Share these stories with your friends and family. A couple of years ago, my partner and I went camping in Vermont during the summer. The first few days were wonderful, but one afternoon, while we were grilling dinner, we heard someone shouting for help. It seemed to be coming from a nearby campsite, just out of view but close enough to hear. My partner and I rushed over to investigate and found something that could have been pulled from a horror movie. A man was leaning against a camp table with a massive wound across his stomach. He had apparently been walking around with a knife when he tripped, and the knife went so deep that it caused him to bleed heavily. We quickly laid him down, and my partner tried to apply pressure to the wound. I pulled out my phone to call for help, only to find I had no service. The nearest hospital was about 20 minutes away, so even if I had reception, it would take too long for help to arrive. That's when my partner had an idea to ask the man where his truck keys were. He told us, and I went to get them. Moments later, we were lifting the man into the back of his truck and driving toward the hospital. The whole situation was even more terrifying for me personally because I've always been incredibly squeamish around blood. I'd fainted from seeing a small cut on my hand before, so I knew I couldn't stay in the back with him. If I did, I'd likely pass out, fall out of the truck bed, and we could have been facing 2 funerals. If I had fainted while driving, it could have been even worse. I told my partner this, but he insisted I drive while he continued applying pressure to the wound. He told me to pull over if I felt lightheaded, but the adrenaline kept me going. We made it to the hospital in 12 minutes. My partner later said we arrived just as the man began to slur his words, a clear sign he was slipping. If we had been any later, he might have lost consciousness, which would have been a lot worse. I'll never forget when the hospital staff opened the truck bed to get the man out, and there was a pool of blood beneath him. My partner's pants were soaked in it. After they took him inside, we drove his truck back to our campsite, and we ended up looking after his dog while trying to carry on with the night, though it felt impossible. The next morning, the man's brother came to collect his belongings. He thanked us for saving his brother's life, and it was an emotional moment. If you've ever been thanked for saving someone's loved one, you know how humbling that can be. We wished him well as we helped him pack up his brother's things. It was a terrifying experience, but we saved a life, and it brought my partner, now my husband, closer to me. Some memory we'll never forget.